and I'm hoping she'll talk about it, but I might not get my wish. So please help welcoming Liz Glynn.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for being here at lunch. All things change, and we change with them. Building is an exercise in human agency. To build is to change one's physical reality through the exertion of energy, and by extension, the will to build is an expression of a desire for change. In my work, I use materials from clay to bronze, concrete, cardboard, and trash to explore cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. My practice is a form of materialist philosophy where transformations of physical matter become a metaphor for potential political change. In 2008, I created my first participatory performance, the 24-hour Roman Reconstruction Project, or Building Rome in a Day. This project came up during the later Bush years when the truism, Rome wasn't built in a day, was the Bush administration's excuse for why they couldn't rebuild Iraq, Afghanistan, or New Orleans. I wanted to ask what happened if we tried in this sort of dumb, naive way, but thinking about what would happen if all of the human will was harnessed rather than relying on subcontractors and bureaucracy. So I worked with the Coalition of the Willing, quote unquote, working approximately 1.238 years per minute on a timeline from 753 BC to 410 AD. The first iteration of the project was at an artist-run space called Machine Project in Los Angeles. And at the end, after several performative interventions marking different specific points in the history of the empire, Rome is sacked by the Visigoths, in this case led by a performance by the group My Barbarian. What was interesting to me about this is that the destruction happens at the hands of people who are harmoniously building minutes before. So much running counter to our normal ideas around social practice where we think about sort of utopian communities, but this idea that destruction was this sort of human instinct and not merely the provenance of this evil Republican other. The project also went to the New Museum in New York City, where Rome fell on the opening of their first triennial. I finished graduate school at CalArts in Los Angeles in 2008 without knowing what 2008 meant in terms of the financial crisis. This is a project I created in 2010 called Three, after one of the three great pyramids. It was a pyramid made out of 600 reclaimed forklift pallets. And when I first moved to Los Angeles, I could no longer find materials like these fragments of peeling architecture from New England, where I'm from. And LA had this mentality of constant renovation. So if I wanted my objects to have history, I had to construct it myself, which often happened through performance. The forklift pallets are marked by the anonymous traces of commerce, but their movement is never tracked or recorded. So this, to me, was similar to the art history of Los Angeles, much of which I heard and learned through stories that other people told me. Guests to the project were invited through a pyramid scheme where everyone got invitations in the postal mail that said you must bring a guest, and everyone would sign their address when they arrived. Each of the performances had a different theme, using the Egyptian Book of the Dead as this metaphoric structure to think through the idea of sort of puddle jumping through one's uncertain financial future. You know, if you paid this credit card bill that month or that student loan payment and maybe took this assisting job or did that show, would it work out? This idea of trying to sort of get through to the other side. So for the first performance, I invited 8 friends, collaborators to eat lunch and under the watch of a registered nurse, take sedatives and create this sort of zombie class, which would then be awakened at dusk by a group of wakers. The wakers came to a hill about half-mile away, walked down the hill when dusk fell, and opened the door of the pyramid, and then read back everyone's irrational fears in the negative, which we had all shared and recorded over lunch. At that point, we were all woken up. This idea was to sort of create this embodiment of this zombie class of people coming out of school in the wake of the financial crisis, and this embodiment of the sort of reifying the state of we are not okay, and trying to use the site as a space to explore that. There were 9 performances in total. I'm only going to talk about a couple. This one began at midnight. It was on eating cakes, drinking ale, and living in the land of the sun, which I took to be Las Vegas. So mummification in ancient Egypt was only used publicly in times of succession crisis. And in this performance, I wanted to replace the body of a single pharaoh with a collective body, which unraveled over the course of about an hour, at which point 9 different kinds of cake were hand-fed to the audience on these unfired ceramic platters, which were then fired in the bonfire. And the financial theme of the night was gambling with other people's money, which continued until dawn, at which point the musical duo Sneaky Snake did a performance as the sun rose. I had gone to college with a guy that worked for Madoff and Associates, and for this performance called On Not Seeing Corruption, I did a role play interview asking him about questions of his role in the company. I'd met him again on the New Year's Eve after Madoff was indicted, immediately prior to this performance. And as we discussed issues of corruption, this 6-foot-long boa constrictor was passed through the audience. I asked people if they were afraid of reptiles in any form, and you can see that Brody has a gold band on his wrist, which signifies that he's willing to handle the snake. Here's a group of everyone on the night of the final performance, at which point the monument was deconstructed. And again, I'm interested in the idea of these temporal spaces. While a lot of my work engages with ideas of monumentality and images that draw from seemingly permanent structures, I'm interested in the way that those things change and that human labor is involved in their construction, maintenance, and often destruction. So that's the end. I won't talk in detail about the following pieces, but I'll just mention that other ways in which I've looked at monumental or utopic structures. This was a performance piece in Times Square for Performa in 2011, where I attempted to recreate Buckminster Fuller's first attempt to make the geodesic dome stand up, the philopahedron, with a group of dancers. At the end, we did this performance 3 times, and at the end, using the collective energy of the audience, we made a construction of Fuller's first successful attempt to make a full-scale geodesic dome, the necklace dome. What I was interested in with this was the way that there was, when Buckminster Fuller first tried to make this thing work, he knew it was going to fail, and he whispered something to Elaine de Kooning to that effect, but he said, let's try it anyway, and the way that failure is inherently a part of progress. I created these 20-foot-long wooden obelisks out of forklift pallet slatting as these large-scale props for performance at the De Cordova Museum in Massachusetts, which were erected with pulleys as human labor. And I won't talk in detail about this, but this is a steel frame effigy based on MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, after the museum's near collapse, which was activated through a performance that was the first of 3, looking at kind of institutional histories and the question of the museum's mortality. Just a few images from that performance. In 2012, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles created this initiative called Pacific Standard Time with the goal of canonizing art in Southern California. And at the time, I was looking at the history of the first performance art festival that happened in Los Angeles that was called Public Spirit. It happened in 1980, and it was organized by the Highland Art Agents, Barbara T. Smith, Chip Chapman, Linda Fry Burnham, and Paul McCarthy. And what was interesting to me when I was reading through these notes is that a lot of the notes from these artists, like very little had changed between what was happening then and what it felt like my friends organizing different artist-run spaces were doing. And I wanted to capture that spirit of performance art and think about that this is at a moment when performance was increasingly entering museums and institutional spaces, and trying to recapture this sort of feral energy rather than think about putting, people like Chris Burden and Mike Kelly on museum walls inside frames. So I created this installation platform with the support of the Getty Research Institute. And we did 11 nights of performance, which function as the sort of after-party venue for these more institutional venues. We had a 5,000 square foot warehouse space. There was a bar, as a number of the early performances that happened in a bar. I made 100 ceramic mugs so all of the artists in the festival could drink for free, because it was a neighborhood a little more central to where most artists lived. All the performances were anonymous, only announced on a chalkboard the night of the show, so that people just had to show up and see what they were going to see and not come for people whose names they knew. We often began the evening with artists from the original festival. So here are Paul McCarthy and Barbara T. Smith talking about their history in Los Angeles in this first festival, Barbara also staged one of her early pieces. And LA really operates in this sort of intergenerational way, in part because of the strong legacy of all of the schools there and artists staying after school. And so there's also this big open raw warehouse space. This is a group called the Sunday Skag, their first collective performance. Sneaky Snake at one point filled the whole space with colored fog. And then there was a small intimate space for performances for only 9 people at the end. It's a performance I did with Don Casper on the last night where we took down the wall of pallets and read the whole history of the original festival as well as the one. In total, it was 11 nights of performance with 65 artists participating and about 4,000 people attending. And Karen Edelman singing at the very end. At the same time as I've pursued the making work through performance, I've also thought a lot about the history of objects and the way that objects can be used to trace shifts in cultural value. This is a group of objects called the California Surrogates for the Getty, which were made of trash and materials used to duplicate sculpture. So the wax, which is used in lost wax casting, and plaster, often used to make copies of classical sculpture. I didn't set out to make work about ancient things necessarily, but I was flipping through an issue of Art News at some point when I was in grad school, and I saw this ancient gold funerary wreath and said, what is that? I want that. And realized very quickly that other people did too, because it was presently being returned to Italy after being illegally acquired. This is a copy of the Euphroneus crater, which was the first object of classical sculpture to be sold for over $1 million. And what was interesting to me is this was acquired by the Met and later had to be returned as it was acquired against the conventions of the UNESCO Cultural Heritage Convention. What was interesting to me about this object is that it didn't sort of slowly acquire this value over time. It was a dealer of antiquities who approached a curator at the Met and said, you know, a Monet just went for over $1 million. Wouldn't it be great to get a piece of classical sculpture to go at that price? And this object was illegally acquired by the Metropolitan and sort of had its sketchy provenance was first reported by the New York Times about a year after its acquisition and only returned about 30 years after that. So I'm interested in the ways that value is declarative and the way that things that we think of sometimes as institutional and monolithic are often the product of subjective decisions made by a very small number of individuals. To that end, I also, this is a long story that I won't tell the entire details of, but I did a whole project tracing the movement of a group of objects declared to be the gold of Troy. This American archaeologist at the turn of the last century, Heinrich Schliemann, decided that he wanted to prove Homer's Iliad, the epic poem, actually happened. So he started excavating in Turkey and found this cache of gold objects at one point that he declared to be the gold of Troy, AKA like objects related to Helen of Troy. This is impossible. Just want to underscore this. And yet, people today are fighting over who owns the gold of Troy. So what I'm standing in front of are bad copies that are displayed in the Neues Museum as a signal to say to Russia, who then took the original gold of Troy, which Schliemann found, excavated, illegally exported from Turkey, paid a fine, donated to the German people. Then the Russians during World War II stole the gold of Troy, hid it in the basement of the Pushkin Museum for 50 years. The Pushkin Museum now displays it prominently after someone approached them in the 90s saying, I think you have the gold of Troy. Now Turkey, Germany, and Russia are all fighting over who owns this, but what is it? It's not Helen of Troy's gold. Helen of Troy did not actually exist, and yet we continue to fight over these objects that we've attached this narrative to. So I created, I made these crappy papier-mâché copies, which I smuggled into the Neues Museum, and then I brought them back and returned them to the Troy archaeological site, which is legendarily one of the most destructive archaeological excavations in human history, and displayed them on these open display cases and made a second set of copies in gold-plated bronze, kind of further confusing the issue of what the authentic thing is. The display cases have no vitrine on top with the idea that you could kind of reach in and steal them. So this is the gold-plated bronze. This is the papier-mâché. It was in a larger exhibition at Pitzer College where I also created this video, Untitled Epic Poem, which had the most violent fragments of text from the Iliad. It was shot facing a World War I cemetery at Gallipoli on the Dardanelles, the strait where the Trojan War was supposedly fought, with my back to very close to Lesbos, an island which is now the home to, or the landing point for a lot of people migrating out of conflict zones. In 2011, after I did the research in Turkey, I also traveled to Egypt several months after the Egyptian Revolution. I grew up outside of Boston, spending a lot of time at the Museum of Fine Arts, which has a large collection of artifacts that were taken out of Egypt when the Great Pyramids were excavated. And when I was a child, I remember asking often, like, what's happening in Egypt now? Like, what's going on? And my mother would always sort of say, oh, it's bad, you don't want to go there. And I felt like contemporary Egypt wasn't, at that point, being represented in museological structures. So when I was invited to participate in a biennial called Made in LA at the Hammer Museum, I wanted to create a work marking this moment in time, but also questioning this idea of made in LA, or like a stereotypically Californian art. So the entrance is this very obfuscating set of structures, but when you look through that hole in the wall, it's sort of clear that there's something on the other side, which is a box of white cotton gloves. There are two tunnels in the installation, one based on the tunnels inside the Grand Gallery passages of the Great Pyramid, so thinking about passage between life and death, but then metaphorically linking that to the smuggling between Egypt and the Gaza Strip, which was happening as a means of sustaining life in Gaza during periods when border security would contract. The Israeli military operation that caused the border security particularly to be tightened was called Operation Cast Lead, as in bullets, which I thought was a quite creepy reference. So these cabinets are called Anonymous Needs and Desires, and it was a physical recreation of an archive of everything that I read in news reports from a certain period of time when this border security issue was happening and smuggling proliferated. So objects, the objects were recreated in cast lead, and the idea of the leaving the cotton gloves out is that visitors to the museum could reach in, take the objects out, and carry them around in their pockets, walk away with them. So I was interested in everything, the difference in the politics of the different news sources, whether they talk about baby food or other humanitarian-like items, or something like a chocolate bar or cigarettes. And another interesting one being the medicine tramadol in the bottom left, which is used for flu medicine in the West, but was something that people took to just cope with the sort of constant stress of living in a conflict zone like the Gaza Strip. This is a show called On the Possibility of Salvage at a temporary pop-up space Paul Cooper Gallery had in New York. And I was looking at issues of piracy, and this first room is staged as this kind of library of loss, either things that were lost at shipwreck and recovered, or things that were from narratives around piracy and sort of stories of bravado told by the pirates during the time when smuggling proliferated during the era of the Dutch East India Company. So in the foreground, there 121 Ming Dynasty porcelain plates, or trade porcelain, that were recovered from an illegal excavation at shipwreck, to a Punic War era battering ram on the left. These three busts shown together, two of them from the same shipwreck recovered off the coast of Italy, but one which had been illegally smuggled and only linked to the shipwreck decades later, and then another, a Ming Dynasty porcelain bust. And then the series of objects as well, including Julius Caesar's purple robes from the time that Caesar at age 25 was captured by pirates, or a chair destroyed by a grenade when pirates sieged an island. In the back room, there was a suspended sculpture of an English smuggling cutter. This might be a good time to mention that I work with a lot of different materials. I had no idea how to build a wooden boat when I started this project. And part of what's interesting to me is the process of researching and figuring out this stuff. So this form of the English smuggling cutter was only developed as a way of evading the heavier British naval ships to smuggle goods. And we think about piracy sometimes. I was interested in piracy in part because of what was happening in Somalia at the time, and the way that piracy often happens not because of some human evil, but rather taxation policy or an unstable government, a lack of, it's a means for survival and a means to an end. So this was this sculpture called Ravaged, Looted, and Burned that was this partially destroyed smuggling cutter, which on the night of the opening, I wanted to activate with a performance that became like a siren song in reverse. So I invited 4 opera singers to come. This is just during the rehearsal, each opera singer came from by ferry and then on foot wearing one of these cloaks, two sopranos singing these sort of tragic arias, one from La Forza del Destino, one from Wagner, and then two altos singing a Somali pirate ransom letter and another list of historic provisions looted by the pirates. The idea was that they would converge upon the ship. So rather than having the siren being this female leading the ship to ruin, the ship became the object of desire and the women became this active force, coming in, converging around the ship, and then singing as they walked around, and all four coming together. In terms of collaboration, this was a bit challenging because the opera singers traditionally wanted a lot more direction. One of them, fortunately, had worked with Meredith Monk before, and at one point someone said, you know, what key do you want us in? I said, oh, it doesn't matter. And they looked at each other and they're like, no. And then they're just like, E, we'll be E, okay, just like ignore her. But so it's often this process of kind of figuring out how to navigate these situations. I was invited to do a series or something at LACMA, and I proposed doing a series of performances around the collection of monumental sculpture. And originally, I came into sculpture through thinking about minimalism, and I thought I was going to respond just to the minimalist and monumental works in LACMA's collection. But LACMA also has a series of posthumously cast Rodins, sculptures by Auguste Rodin, which were cast around 1965 or so long after the artist died. And I thought, well, I should look at those Rodins to do due diligence, but I have no interest in figurative sculpture. I don't understand this work. I'll look at that Rodin guy, that, important guy. And this very strange thing happened, which is when I started looking at his work and understanding his process, there was a phrase that stood out in one of the texts, the idea of him cannibalizing his own oeuvre and working with all these fragments, and that for a lot of his life, he was actually sort of the more radical, innovative works like the Monument to Balzac at the time, which at the time was quite radical, that he spent a lot of time sort of with his floor littered with bits and pieces and feeling like a failure. And that was interesting to me. And I wanted to kind of re-inject the sense of process into Rodin rather than this idea of this artist being this great man. So what I wanted to do was take fragmentary molds of the Rodin sculptures and sort of Frankenstein them back together into these new objects. It took about 6 months working with the curator and the museum to get permission to do this. But at which point I embarked upon this collaboration with the Department of Conservation. Don Medveg in the foreground was a conservator that had been there for 38 years, and he supervised the mold making process. The only argument against the mold making would be that it could affect the patina, and part of my argument was that many art historians think the posthumous Rodins shouldn't be considered real because the patina that was developed during Rodin's lifetime wasn't actually replicated when they made the posthumous Rodins. So I did this, we created these molds separately, and then I did a live 2-day performance with a group of young emerging sculptors making these Frankenstein bodies, cannibalizing, tearing parts off, using weird bits of flesh in places that they don't belong, and created about 8 figurative sculptures. There were 5 more performances in the cycle, including a ballet mécanique based on the commissioning of Alexander Clare's Hello Girls. The girls were the women of the Art Museum Council who commissioned the piece, and they had saved all the correspondence for the commissioning. This piece quickly became a comedy of errors where this sculpture, which arrived as very grand fanfare, quickly the arms were flying off it. The piece was destroyed almost as though in the windstorm, and over the course of the performance, the piece is deinstalled and reinstalled 5 times. I had a group of art handlers. You see the men in the white t-shirts with the water bottles. They doubled between being the art handlers who reinstalled the piece and the jets who spit water at the fountain. This was a performance called The Myth of Pure Form, looking at the original plywood form of Tony Smith's Smoke, but also asking the question of how it came to get to LACMA. There's a totally bizarre reference on the didactic for this piece, which references Rebecca Beldegrun's 65th birthday. I was like, who is Rebecca Beldegrun and who cares about her birthday? Well, this piece was, the money to keep this piece at LACMA, which had been brought on long-term loan, came because the museum director approached his board of trustees and said, the piece is about to go. And we had a birthday cake that interrupted the performance, and this was all explained in the text that was distributed with the performance. But sort of what I was interested in is some of the seemingly dumb questions that people ask when they're in a museum, like who paid for this? How did it get here? Like, if you actually follow the logic of those questions and answer them, they can tell you a lot about these institutions. And thinking about the way that these institutions are collections of individuals doing the best that they can, trying to make these decisions, rather than this monolithic entity that has a set of rules chiseled in stone somewhere. So that was part of what I was interested in. The end of the performance cycle was a deliberately unmonumental attempt to recreate Donald Judd's Untitled for Leo Castelli on the left, which it had been noted in the conservation files should be refabricated. We set up all of the scaffolding and formwork as though we could replicate the piece, and even brought in a cement mixture. But at the end, I went through the kind of uneven record of conservation around Donald Judd's work and pointed out that ultimately no material except gold is permanent, and refabricating this piece would only set in motion the same set of problems that had happened prior. Going back to the sculptures from the Myth of Singularity, we finished the piece, which was originally intended as a performance. I was interested in the possibility of kind of completing the cycle and turning them back into bronze, which hadn't been part of the original intent of the piece, but going back and recreating this patina. The plasters we made were really messy and had a lot of the qualities of performance still in them. So like there was rubble that I smashed into the face of this version of After the Thinker, or all of the fingerprints on it. I was a little afraid of using bronze because I feel like in some cases artists use it uncritically. It's kind of, it can be where contemporary sculpture goes to die and artists just make addition bronzes. It's a viable commercial strategy. But I wanted to see if there was a way to keep all the details of the performance intact. So these sculptures, I worked with a foundry to them recast in bronze, and then we exhibited them again at LACMA. This is just to show you the level of detail. So what I did was I created a 178-page PDF circling all the tiny little threads and bits of stuff. A lot of this can't be picked up in the mold making process, so to remake the details of a performance which is very improvisatory and fast, it takes quite a lot of time. And I spent a lot of time myself at the foundry doing this level of detail that the foundry on their own just won't do. These are just a few images of the sculptures. The sculptures themselves change quite a lot. This is the Petite Palais, which looks very different than LACMA, kind of much more contemporary setting. I showed them also at Paula Cooper Gallery in New York, but the show had been planned for January 2017, right after the election, and I felt very strange about showing this group of sculptures in that context, even though there was something about the way the bodies kind of took on this damaged, almost bandaged quality from the use of the burlap in them that I felt was fitting, but there's something that felt cold about this. And so I was looking for a picture of this and I couldn't find it. We did a performance on the day of the opening called Regarding the Pain of Others, where I worked with about 4 different dancers. Each of them had a set of headphones where they were hearing a track of different texts from a different period of populist revolt, whether we did the sans-culotte prior to the French Revolution, the British working class during the time of industrialization, protesting working conditions, Wisconsin in 2008. And each dancer was sort of moving through the space, and a singer periodically kind of wailing out, and I was reading. I would walk around the space and take off their headphones and read back the text to the audience that they were kind of embodying. But trying to kind of create this physical, temporal presence in the space of these objects. In the front room, I also had a number of these smaller ceramic works, trying to get a lot of this idea of like the hand back into the sculpture. Briefly, this is a piece that I did in La Antigua, Guatemala, on the site of a Spanish colonial convent that fell at the height of arranged marriage in the time of the colonies. La Antigua had been the capital of Guatemala prior to this point. And arranged marriage in the colonies was often happened where the bride and groom would meet for the first time. And I was conscious of coming as an American into this biennial, which was mostly Guatemalan artists, and not speaking great Spanish. So I worked with the groom, Juan Carlos, and we created a dialogue between us where I'm speaking in English, he's speaking in Spanish, and I have this dowry dress which is made of all of the ruins of the prior performances on the site. This is a space called Concepcion 41 that they encourage artists to kind of cannibalize the histories of other things that have happened on the site. So I used all of this stuff, created this performance onto the roof of the convent, talked about marriage as this contractual obligation and form of bondage. And at the end of the performance, he said something to me that I still have not translated. This is a body of work. There are a number of works that I haven't showed looking at the history of kind of physical vestiges of financial capital. And I had been researching the Medici banking empire and the history of abstraction in the financial system. And one of the things that was interesting to me about the Medici, who are famed as these patrons of art, is that the Medici spent most generations after Cosimo the Magnificent. There were about 4 generations of the Medici just pushing debt around. They were always operating the negative, but just moving things back and forth. So I created this installation based on furniture from the Medici Grand Ducal Furniture Workshop. The piece is called Hold Nothing. And in the foreground, you see this green table, which is called the transaction table. The word banking comes from the Italian banco, which means table. And in Renaissance Italy, banking took place across a table. But if you think about banking as a relationship rather than banking as a vessel to be filled up, it kind of changes your idea about money and the function of money. So there are all these cabinets, also these tile works, and then I worked with this group of furniture movers to activate the pieces, kind of installing it as though they were moving into an apartment and periodically tipping all of the drawers forward that made this really loud noise and kind of highlighting their emptiness, but the idea of these kind of empty vessels and this sort of call for accumulation. And this is Ransom Room from Sculpture Center. So when I did that project around the gold of Troy, I was reading a bunch of histories of gold as a material, and I stumbled across this story that was positively horrifying, which is the story of the Inca, the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. So as the story goes, Francisco Pizarro heard the story of this storied palace with gold-paneled walls and golden corn, the palace of the father of Atahualpa, the Inca emperor. This was the era of Spanish conquest of the quote-unquote New World. So I created this anachronistic version. This is an evolving installation. It opens with this. I actually very deliberately did not look at Inca artifacts when I was creating some of this. So this is, supermarket corn in here, rather than corn that looks like Inca sculptures of corn, as well as these gold paneled walls. And you see a little bit of red on those walls. They're not made of gold. I thought about making them out of scrap metal, but what I ended up using was the red sculpture wax that's used in lost wax casting. It's a sort of indexical relationship to the idea of casting. As the story went, the Spanish held the Inca emperor hostage for a ransom 14 by 21 feet to the height of his outstretched hand, so about 7 feet high, filled once with gold and twice with silver. And the ransom was accumulated from the far corners of the empire, which I took to be the outer boroughs of New York. So every day I worked at a different, this is Pioneer Works, I worked at Cabinet, worked at Socrates Sculpture Park, casting as much ransom as I could physically carry, or just casting all day. And I would throw this stuff into these kind of granny bags, thinking about this question of whose stuff would get thrown out and whose stuff gets saved and put into museums. Thinking about the population of the outer boroughs. The second you put this stuff into these bags and go on the subway, you are disgusting. It is not art. You are not an artist that matters at all. This is gross. And people on the subway would kind of move away from me, or would just cough at me or sneer at me because I was taking up all this space with all this dirty, grimy gold stuff. I would dump all the sculptures back at the end of the day at Sculpture Center, where they slowly accumulated, and became this problem of kind of me against empire, like how much can I cast, which was never enough. Built up over time. The story does not end well for the Inca. The emperor was executed after a mock trial, at which point the Spanish started melting down all of the objects into ingots. They kept very close track of who got how many ingots to pay off the conquest voyage, to reward the priest that traveled with them. They did not make any record of what they melted down. So on site at Sculpture Center during the last week of the exhibition, I melted everything into ingots, which now exist as these different groups of objects, piles based on the distribution. A lot of people came and they were like, can you go back to the corn? Can you go back to just leave some of these objects, leave that wall, it's better that, can you just leave, could you just stop? basically, and it's like the point is no, actually. That there's kind of this cost of destruction, which is part of what I'm interested in. Slightly out of order, but just one more piece in relationship to thinking about financial abstraction. This is a performance I did in London earlier this year called the Fear Index. It was at the Frieze Art Fair, and I was interested in the kind of speculative, performative quality of expenditure and hype. So I worked with a group of dancers and created a soundtrack and had a phone number that people could text reports of art sales or lack of art sales to me. During every 15 minutes on the hour, the dancers would come out and perform a market report of some sort, depending on whether nothing at all was happening or things were wildly moving. So by the end of it, they're actually kind of near static, but they're points where this is kind of a more active point in the installation. This is an image of William Collins Whitney's Gilded Age Ballroom. This was a space that was designed to house the most exclusive 1,000 New Yorkers for events only once a year in this cutthroat social ritual of the ball that is described really well in Edith Wharton's novels. And I was invited to create a project for Central Park by the Public Art Fund. And one of the things that interested me when I started researching it is the Central Park's the first public park in the nation, and after I got through all the stuff about Frederick Law Olmsted, in the 1980s there were all these texts talking about how people inhabiting the park were a problem. And I wanted to create a work that seemed really antithetical to me, the notion of public use for the park. So I wanted to take this highly rarefied private space and make it kind of recast it as a trompe l'oeil ruin open to all. So I remodeled all of the furniture in the studio, recreated all the textile patterns in pencil, then had them laser cut out of chipboard, took existing furniture with similar proportions, reinforced it, modeled all the details. That was my weird attempt at correcting my draftsmanship. And all these photographs are taken really early in the morning, but the piece kind of was intended to function as a public living room at a time when people are fighting over air rights in New York, and increasingly plants are dying in Central Park because people are building multi-million-dollar condos on the edge of it. I'm someone that lived in New York before I went to grad school. I never moved back, in part because of the real estate economy of that city not being accessible to someone without a trust fund. Thinking about this question of the idea that New Yorkers have a choice in terms of what kind of space they want to inhabit. Okay, I'm gonna skip this for a moment. Sometimes I'm in the studio making, ceramics. So these are a series of masks that were formed through blind gesture. This was another piece that kind of, this whole series of works I've called emotional architecture, coming out of making the molding on the work for the Public Art Fund. But there are a lot of times I'm in my studio making things with my hands where I'm covered with plaster or concrete. I can't touch my phone. I don't answer email in a timely manner because I'm doing this, and I feel like a complete Luddite. And one of the criticisms you sometimes hear about object-based work or painting is, oh, you're just participating in capitalism. The way I make things is the most inefficient, uncapitalist, sometimes wasteful, but it's driven by a totally different set of logics. And I wanted to ask the question of, can making function as a resistant practice rather than this complicit form of capitalism? And I wanted to ask this question in the context of mass mocha. So this is the last project I'll show you, which was called The Archeology of Another Possible Future. When I was invited to do the show, I started just by going to the space, and I knew I wanted to create this kind of labyrinthine journey that would be somehow encyclopedic. So I visited the space when it was completely empty. It's 275 feet long, so it takes about 3 minutes to walk across if you're going my dad's pace, which is kind of a power walk that's awkward in a museum environment. I have to work with digital models sometimes to make pieces like this, but for me, the thing that makes the most sense was walking through the space and kind of figuring out how fast I wanted people to move. And this became the plan I did this all on foot with mason twine behind me, and then went back and measured it and put that into a digital model, which became the plan for the piece. So the installation is in 5 parts with 2 appendices. It opens with 3 analog caves. Thinking about this, and there's this one stainless steel tumbleweed in the foreground that sort of alludes to this future following. Each of the analog caves, there's the tumbleweed. This is the touch cave with industrial felt that's used also in tooling. You think about Joseph Beuys or Robert Morris, but people could kind of sit in the piles on the floor. The sound cave, full spectrum, that had, on the right, there's a tape cassette piece with interviews of people ages 5 to 89 talking about what they thought the past was like and what they think the future will be like. All of these different speculations. At some point during the course of the interviews, I had an oncologist explain to me, he was talking about the difference between how there's so many new cancer drugs that he won't be able to know in the future what all the side effects are because there are just so many drugs and so forth. And then also there was a sound piece on a vinyl record which was recorded analog, so there was no breaking of the sound wave into a digital break. This full spectrum sound recording, let me just, oh, that's no good, hold on. Let's try that again. It's not gonna let me turn the sound up. I'm gonna just skip the sound. I think about sound as this, it's much louder than that, it's really loud, okay. Anyway, there was a sound piece that was recorded with the singer Karen Edelman, who I mentioned earlier, that thinking about music as the site where people can be present in a way that often, that is pretty rare in contemporary life, but the way that the sound on the speakers actually you could kind of feel it move through your body. There were these ceramic pieces, each of which had a different smell inside, linked to a philosophical idea. This whole installation was activated once with a day-long performance. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I worked with my collaborator, Corey Fogel, the percussionist, and Karen Edelman. This was kind of this, I started with this blindfolded interaction with the installation where I kind of performed a sort of contact improvisational physical engagement with the caves blindly for the first hour or two of the performance while Corey was doing these different percussive interventions. There were 13 sculptures of different theories of the shape of progress. So thinking about this question of whether we're getting better. I read a lot of technological theories and theory from the 60s where they talk about the idea that we're gonna like end racism, end poverty, solve world hunger, and I don't think people feel that way anymore, and particularly growing up in the 1980s and also, you know, post 9/11, that the idea of American exceptionalism is sort of in decline. So this is a piece called The Whittle Down to the 1%. It's a physical embodiment of a graph of rising income inequality with this shiny stick that you kind of want to reach out and touch but can't quite reach. Avalanche of Consumer Goods from Joseph Schumpeter. This piece was based on a Bureau of Labor Statistics graph of the amount of household chores men and women do in a day. The one on the left is to exactly my height. You can guess the gender. And this is creative destruction, a pile of old industrial things from a factory destroyed by this input of a single tablet. Massmoka's was a former textile mill turned into a capacitor factory that employed thousands of people in the neighborhood until it closed in the 1980s. And thinking about this question of what these people, after these industries go away, what do they do with themselves? This was a sculpture called American Progress, based on the only figure in the show, but based on the strange John Gast painting. It's this image of sort of liberty floating across the plains, bringing power and chasing away the natives in this horrible image of manifest destiny. But this idea, the recurrent image of this goddess-like female figure, whether it's the Nike of Samothrace or the Statue of Liberty, this divine thing that's going to save us, and wondering like who or what that is. There were 3 shipping containers too in the show. This one was a job site office for this wonderful man named Tony Pisano, who served as the caretaker for the exhibition on the weekends during the course of the show. Tony had worked in the industrial manufacturing, and he was incredibly handy. So let me give you a little taste of Tony, if this will play. Oh no, here's the video. Yes. So he'd talk about, he had a chalkboard, but he'd interact with people and explain to them how stuff works. He was making all these looms. He created this funny kinetic sculpture. You could bring in a lamp and he'd fix it for you. I remember when we first interviewed him, he sent just this very short email. He was like, I have a table saw part on my kitchen floor. And I was just like, that guy. He grew corn and made a broom out of corn over the course of it. But thinking about both the idea that Tony's skills are going to be lost when Tony's generation dies, but the question of what do Tony's children end up doing? What happens to all these people, and what is the responsibility of an employer like Mass MoCA that has replaced them, was another question that came up to me after interviewing a lot of people that had worked in the union at Sprague, the former capacitor factory. This container contained 244 drawings of failed and outmoded technologies, which I started making way too late because I couldn't figure out how to define failure. And a lot of the things about failed technologies look like these kind of quirky objects. And then I realized you have things like Leonardo's diagram of what a helicopter should look like, which was never built and never worked. But the idea that a history of failure is actually a history of progress, that you have all these attempts to make things that don't work before you get to something that does. There were Y2K doomsday prophecies read by a machine voice in the foreground, and then this video of kind of bodies disappearing into this white light shot in the basement of Mass MoCA in the background. Think about the disappearance of the physical body of the worker, moving into the section we call the Age of Ephemeralization. This was a sculpture called Moore's Law, thinking about the idea that the rate of computer chips doubles past the speed that which we can comprehend. I was reading a lot about the advent of machine learning and this question of like what happens when technology exceeds our bodies and what happens to our bodies. The exhibition ends with this series of stainless steel catwalks, sort of embodying this kind of shiny hope, but also a notion of precarity. On the platforms, there are these 3D printers that were continually operating during the course of the show, and the printers are contact mic'd, as are the platforms. So when you're walking on the platforms, you hear the sound of your own movement coupled with the printer sound, and then the prints accumulated under the towers. There's a sort of dystopic image of kind of a post-apocalyptic vacation land inspired by Aldous Huxley. One more image from the performance. Thinking about what happens to the workers when the machines take over. Huxley thought we'd be bored and miserable rather than liberated. So there are standing lamps, these kind of stainless steel stretchers, more of the tumbleweeds. Then in the last room, there's a history of pre-industrial revolution technology, thinking about technology as an extension of the body. Are 3D printed things that I paper machéed, and then these plaster and old found object pieces. Then in the last space, there were a series of 20 different posters that you could take, each one being a photograph of sort of abstract or random encounter in the kind of industrial wasteland landscape. This was one of my favorites, which is a quote from people working in the Tesla factory, thinking about this incredibly advanced technology that was giving everyone repetitive stress injuries where their bodies hadn't been accounted for. Generally speaking, I think about my work as a space to ask the broadest possible set of questions and reframe possibility. I'm not a policymaker, I'm not a scientist, but what I can do and what art can do is sort of reframe the set of questions and try to look at a larger space of what can and should happen. That's it. Thank you so much. Questions? Yeah, does anyone have questions? I know some people have to leave, but.
How do you do this much of planning for producing this many work? You have a short time. What is the longest period of time? And also, those institutions, they need to know what you're doing. Months, if not years before. How do you have this much of the spontaneity, but really working on details, but still make up all those amazing projects?
The Mass Mocha show took about 2 years, but a lot of it got built in 5 or 6 weeks. Or no, 5 weeks on install. And
Aligned with the idea, but not
what typically happens for me is the research takes a really long time and probably longer than it should. And even when I'm just doing a sculpture exhibition, it still takes just deciding on the material, because that's not a given for me. And then figuring out how to make the material do what I want it to also takes time. If it's something that big, there's engineering involved and so forth. So that often means the production time is crunched, and the production time is just a feverish push. It's also, with some of the larger projects, I am working with a team of people to execute them, but I'm also really particular about a lot of the physical qualities of it, and so making sure there's enough time for my own hands to do the things that I can't ever explain how they need to be to someone else. So I don't know, it gets done. I don't do a lot of other things. Freeze London. Freeze London in the context of incoming Brexit. Oh yes, someone else had mentioned. Yeah, I hadn't actually seen that work until I made this work, which was interesting. I am here visiting to think about doing something for Converge. Can I say that? Yeah, maybe in the next year or so. Anyone else?
So, CalArts, you are very material-based, which for me, coming out of CalArts, sort of different. And it sounds like that was something that really was driven after school and through these other projects. But did you find that you had a community around that there were still people, producing it, like Greg was saying, like to the scale and as many and as much, and the studio time in the studio for that sort of process and thinking was as important and taught and described as such? Did you understand that as you were leaving school?
That's a really interesting question. So I TA'd for the legendary conceptual artist Michael Asher, and I remember the first studio visit we had, he came into my studio and I had all of my like power tools under the desk, which I had very proudly brought from the East Coast, and he was like, "What are those? Are those yours?" And he just kind of like couldn't deal with it. And I remember when I was making the pyramid, actually, Michael was, his health was not doing well, and we kept in touch after school, but I felt like I couldn't talk to him during the pyramid. Like I didn't talk to him during that period because I felt like that work was breaking a lot of his rules in terms of the conceptual kind of linearity and transparency. Like I was making a lot of intuitive connections that I felt like I wasn't allowed to according to Michael's formulation. And that, like I felt guilty about it. And I came into sculpture from photography, and I didn't trust my own hands to make anything. Like I was never trained to sculpt in the traditional sense. And I only started working with like clay later on. And still when I now teach ceramics, but I'm a pretty, it works the best when I do it in a messy, gestural, almost don't look at it and can't look at it way, because I've just never come out of like a kind of traditional painting and sculpture background. And it was funny, when I was at CalArts, I started making performance work, and they're like, "Oh, stop making sculpture, you're fine. Just make the performance. We like the performance better." And for whatever reason, I just had this instinct, I'm like, no, I can make sculpture. And part of why I came to LA is I was really interested in the dialogue around sculpture. I think they do different things. And they perform different functions, but I'm interested in the way also with sculpture that these objects can carry a lot of nonverbal meanings, that like even though a lot of the ways that I work are linguistically driven and based, that there's a way that the objects speak, and that like I can fall in love with like an ancient artifact or a piece of something, and it can do all these things that I can't do in a performance in the same way. So I've kind of held on to that as a way of working, but I think it's also never let's make objects for object's sake. Like I've sort of avoided that. They're in the permanent collection of LACMA, but I think they're not on view right now, and they periodically they're somewhere. So. I don't think I worry about them being illustrative. I try to work with references that everyone knows something about. Like the research informs what I do, but it's less like you have to have read, this really thick theory book to read this, or you have to have read this history to understand it. Like I want people to have some kind of intuitive connection, like even if they don't know everything about Rodin or anything about the Inca, they have some knowledge of it. But I think about the objects as kind of trying to open up a space to rethink the thing rather than like, this is the marker that this happened, but it's more like, here's a way to enter into this that is very different than reading like a journalistic account of something. And like, what do you think about it when you're in this installation? Like, what questions do you ask? Even with like the ransom room installation, people would come in and not know the story and kind of make up their own story of what happened. And then some would choose to read the text and understand the history, some wouldn't. But that was also sort of like, I'm interested too in the way that people assign narrative to objects and kind of construct their own meanings. And anyone else? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for.
You just got it yesterday.
Yeah, very late.